I'd like to bring in former federal prosecutor and Fox News contributor Andy McCarthy and attorney Brian Claypool, who have been watching this very closely as we've gone through. So closing arguments on the part of the prosecution went on for a couple of hours. Andy, your thoughts on how they did in closing this case on their side?
I was really surprised, Martha, that there weren't objections by the defense because, you know, Binger's theory here is that the provocation that he's arguing is brought about because Rittenhouse, by Binger's account, is in a place where he doesn't belong. He's like an out-of-towner who's come in, intruding into a scene that he doesn't belong in, that his possession of a gun, which he suggested to the jury was illegal, even though that count is out of the case. So I was kind of surprised they didn't object to that. But he's saying legal gun possession, legally in the neighborhood, all of that is a provocation by which somehow he forfeits his right of self-defense. So what he's trying to do is suggest that in the entire continuum of the circumstances, this kid did a lot of things that he shouldn't have done, and therefore that was provocative to the people that he ultimately interacted with, and he doesn't get to defend himself if in the course of those interactions he's assaulted. And I think we're going to hear from the defense, obviously, that that's not what the standard is.
Yeah. You know, one of the things, Brian Claypool, that he was touching on right at the end there was that there's a very high standard for justifying self-defense in killing someone. And he said you have to have a reasonable person has to believe that they were at risk of death or great bodily harm. And obviously the prosecution is arguing that that was not the case, that there were other things that Kyle Rittenhouse could have done to get out of there and to de-escalate that situation.
Well, Martha, Binger's doing the best he can, but unfortunately, if you fly a plane that's got a bad engine, it's going to go down eventually. And the two most profound facts that really gravitate against the prosecution, let's talk about the first one. That videotape that Binger plays ad nauseum, it helps the defense. Why? Because it shows that all three of the gentlemen shot were the aggressors. There's no mistake about it. I mean, let's focus quickly on Rosenbaum. I mean, he throws a bag at Rittenhouse. He's then charging at Rittenhouse. Rittenhouse is running away. Rittenhouse isn't running toward Rosenbaum. And then, this is critical, there's soot on the hand of Rosenbaum. What does that tell you? That tells you that Rosenbaum's hand is almost on the gun of Rittenhouse. So arguably, that makes Rittenhouse in fear for his life, and he shoots. And then you look at Huber. There was videotape of Rittenhouse being on the ground after being hit with a skateboard, and then you've got Gage Grosskreutz testifying that he did point a gun at Rittenhouse before Rittenhouse shot. So all of this videotape evidence shows that those three are the aggressors. And then the last point I want to make real quick, Martha, is Binger admitted toward the end of his closing argument, he said, look, if that was me, I probably wouldn't have done what these gentlemen did. That, to me, is really the theme of the defense case. These three gentlemen, why did they do what they did? They should have just walked away. Rittenhouse points his gun, walk away. Had they walked away, we wouldn't be here today talking about this.
You know, Andy, one of the things that the themes that Binger was trying to hammer home is that he shouldn't have been there. Okay, he's appealing to the jury with the argument that this 17-year-old young man, over the course of the evening, continued to sort of walk back toward the danger. He sort of tries to destruct the idea that he is a credible medic, or that he was protecting a building that the owners had already taken everything out of, and they didn't come there to protect their building themselves, and he has no association with it. So why is he there? To that point, to the why was he there in the first place point, how relevant is that for these jurors?
It's not, well, it shouldn't be relevant for them, and it shouldn't have been relevant for the prosecutor because it's all lawful conduct. what Binger is trying to suggest is that because he was doing all these things under circumstances where Binger doesn't think it was reasonable, even if it was lawful, that was provocative, and therefore, by provoking supposedly everything that happens thereafter, he forfeits his right to self-defense. And then the other thing he says, Martha, is by he's running around carrying this gun, it was reasonable after the Rosenbaum shooting for people to think he was an active shooter. But what we saw in the video that Binger himself played is that Rittenhouse must have run past scores of people, if not hundreds of people. He didn't open fire on anyone other than the 3 people who attacked him. So if he's an active shooter that everybody should have a right to try to stop, you would think he would be actively shooting. But he was only shooting at the people who attacked him, and he ran past dozens of people, obviously able to shoot them if he had been an active shooter, and didn't.
I just want to point out before this gets back underway again, and we have a few minutes, that there's a lot of graphic language in this, a lot of very graphic images as well. So we just want to give people that warning as we continue to cover this throughout the day.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.